He earned his PhD in history from the State University of New York at Buffalo, in 2016. He has published in academic journals as well as popular outlets such as the Washington Post, and has appeared as a guest on podcasts, including Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. His new book, Pink Triangle Legacies, Coming Out in the Shadow of the Holocaust, was just published by Cornell University Press and named by the Lambda Literary Foundation as one of the most anticipated LGBTQIA+ books of 2022 in the category of nonfiction. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, exhibits, and plays, Dr. Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ+ history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, DC. And of course, we're living in a moment of urgency with anti-Semitism, homophobic and transphobic rhetoric that is fundamental to conservative and fascist thinking and actions, reappearing in moments such as the convoy here in Ottawa earlier this year and across the world. So books like Jake's here are critically important at this time, and I'm just really looking forward to the conversation tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jake Newsome to this conversation.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Noah. Glad to be here.
So Jake, to begin, I guess we can start by what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, this is a project that I've been working on really for the past decade, and well, longer if you count going back to college, which is too many years for me to count backwards. I'm not a math major, right? I as an undergraduate student, I took every course that my university had on the Holocaust, on Nazi Germany and World War II, because this was a history that I had not learned about in high school. And so I was once I got to college and learned about it, was very interested in trying to dive deeper and learn more. This was also a time in my life, as a college student, where I was in the process of coming out and trying to understand, my own identity as a gay person, how I fit into the world and fit into history. And so after 4 years of studying, Nazi German history, it occurred to me that I had not studied about what happened to people that we would today call members of the LGBTQ community, and so really this project was a historical kind of professional project for me, but it was also a personal project because I wanted to be able to understand what happened to people like me during the era of the Holocaust. And so as I got into the archives, I thought I was going to be writing a history, of LGBTQ folks in Germany between 1933 and 1945. But ultimately, the scope of the project really took on a new dimension as I began to study what happened to these same queer survivors after the Holocaust. So yeah, I know that we'll get to talk more in depth about that, but I'm also interested, Noah, in learning how, what brought you to study a very similar topic and time frame.
Of course, yeah. My academic background is in feminist and gender studies, as well as Jewish studies. And at the MA level, as Anne described before, I was fortunate enough to be employed on the project Hear Our Voices, Holocaust Survivors Share Their Stories of Trauma and Hate, which is a bilingual online course that uses oral testimony and the voices of Holocaust survivors to educate students on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, developed in part by my supervisor, Dr. Deidre Butler. And I contributed to the module there in gender and sexuality. And it's on that project that I was sort of struck by the severe lack of information or understanding of queer and trans experiences of the Holocaust, and importantly, also queer Jewish experiences of the Holocaust. Of course, this is also very personal work, as you described and as we've discussed. And so my own identity as a queer and trans person deeply informs my approach to the material and the work that I do now, tracing trans histories of the Holocaust. There's a need to place trans individuals into the historical register in general and queer individuals as well. But of course, there's significant limitations of language, like you just kind of noted, and like not wanting to impose modern identity categories on folks who didn't move through the same world that we do now. And that complicates our approaches to history and is forcing us to ask questions uniquely, kind of as you do in your book, which is wonderful. Yeah.
Well, no, thanks for sharing that. That's why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you this evening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To begin, I guess, can you tell us what life was like for LGBTQ plus people living under the Nazi regime, sort of where you start your story?
Yeah, and I think one of the important points to note about this history is that right before the Nazi regime, right, Germany was a democracy called the Weimar Republic, and in the largest cities in Germany, especially in Berlin, LGBTQ people had built a community and a culture of, I'm not going to call it full acceptance, but at least an unprecedented level of tolerance that just didn't exist anywhere else in the world at the time. And in fact, people came from Paris and London and New York to Berlin to experience the LGBTQ culture that had emerged there. The rising Nazi party made it known from very early on that it stood firmly against these progressive measures for the LGBTQ community. And I think it's important to realize that their homophobic and transphobic stances and policies weren't rooted in in kind of morals or religion, but was very rooted in essentially racism and eugenics. They, just in the same way that the Nazis racialized anti-Semitism, they also racialized homophobia. They believed that the LGBTQ community essentially was a threat to the German or the Aryan birth rate. So they believed that gay people robbed the fatherland of future children, and so there was in Nazi Germany, the procreation of the so-called master race was always, the most important ideal in the nation. So the Nazis, used a web of laws that supposedly, they used to criminalize certain acts. One that comes to mind as the most famous is called Paragraph 175, which was a German law that actually predated the Nazis that criminalized so-called unnatural indecency between men. And so this was a national anti-gay law. And the Nazis used this law. In fact, they amended it to give themselves more power. But over the course of their rule, they arrested about 100,000 queer men under this anti-gay law, Paragraph 175. And so here on your screen, you can see a chart showing the annual convictions under this law. So it was technically in use since 1871, but once the Nazis come to power, you can see this really drastic rise. Mm-hmm. Out of these, the men who were arrested, over half of them were ultimately convicted, and somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders. So these were men who were arrested more than once under the law, were then sent to concentration camps where they were subjected to really of course, really barbaric and intrusive medical experiments that were aimed at trying to cure them or make them straight again, or even submitting them to harder work details, because harder work was seen as like a man's job. And so if you put gay men into harder work details, it would supposedly make them more masculine and manly and therefore straight. And one of the things we'll talk about after this is the badge that the Nazis used on the gay prisoners' uniforms was the pink triangle, just like all the other prisoner groups got a colored triangle on their uniform.
I noted before that there's an absence in like like experiences of the Holocaust being documented by historians, and there's just very complicated understanding as it is like now that we're approaching this. But I think what I was struck by in my initial research and like ongoing, like constantly struck by, is how folks like Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld in Berlin at the Institute of Sexology were performing gender affirming surgeries, later offering documents called like transvestite passes in English. And to go from there to this total shift under National Socialism is really striking. And part of the reason that we don't have the resources or the same resources for queer and trans individuals is because of the way that, for example, trans people were often persecuted under their assigned sex at birth, which now obscures our view looking backwards when we see instances of trans women being categorized as gay men or trans men being categorized as lesbians or asocials. Yeah, so I'm really interested in, I guess, do you have any more to touch on about life under National Socialism, queer life under National Socialism, or can we move into what was the situation like for LGBTQ plus people after the end of World War II?
So I think you bring up a really good point, Noah, about the existence of many, or I would say even most of the historical sources we have to do this research and tell this history, unfortunately, are through the lens of the perpetrators, right? It's documentation left behind by the Nazis. And so, for example, even taking the case of paragraph 175, right, which very explicitly applied only to men, for a long time, this law and historians even writing about it would say, 100,000 gay men were persecuted under the law, when in reality we don't. It's impossible for us to know the actual identity, or the sexual identity of all the men persecuted under the law, because, as you mentioned, the Nazis didn't accept transgender identities as legitimate. So, for example, a transgender woman would have been treated as a gay cross-dressing man, according to Nazi ideology and policy. And so a lot of those men were, a lot of transgender women were arrested under paragraph 175. But it's also important to note that just because lesbians weren't mentioned under paragraph 175, that doesn't mean that they escaped persecution. In fact, the Nazis used a different, a number of webs of laws to go after women who were known to be in relationships with other women. And we're always kind of forgetting that the Gestapo and the SS did not need any law whatsoever to be able to apprehend someone and send them to a concentration camp. So, a lot of the statistics we have now are about gay men specifically or queer men specifically, but don't necessarily tell the whole picture for all of LGBTQ people in Nazi Germany. And the last thing that I want to say before moving on to the post-war period is, Noah, you mentioned how in pre-Nazi Germany, Hirschfeld was even giving out, or issuing, trans affirming surgery and healthcare. And to me, you're right. It's such a sudden shift to go from that all the way to even as early as March of 1933, where the Nazis are really destroying LGBTQ culture. And I think that speaks to the widespread underlying homophobia and transphobia that existed in German society at the time. Just very similar to the way that the Nazis didn't have to invent anti-Semitism, they didn't have to invent homophobia. And in fact, we know that German citizens very enthusiastically contributed to the Nazis' campaign against the LGBTQ community. 1/3 of all paragraph 175 cases that resulted in a conviction came from civilian denunciations. These were men, average citizens turning in these people to the Nazis. So I just wanted to point that out. Your comment made me think of that. And now, to your question about the post-war period, what was the situation of LGBTQ folks after World War II? The Allies defeated Germany in May of 1945, and a lot of prisoners in the concentration camps clearly, understood this and experienced this as a moment of liberation. But the Allies, really, led by the Americans, developed a policy in which they released all concentration camp prisoners who had been imprisoned based on their race, political resistance, or religion. But they said that releasing the so-called common criminals back into the general population was not a good idea, because they wanted to protect the safety of defeated Germans. Because those pink triangle prisoners, right, the prisoners who have been imprisoned because of being gay, because they had broken a national law that technically predated the Nazis, the Allies treated them as common criminals. So if pink triangle prisoners had any prison sentence left on their term, the Allies transferred them from the liberated concentration camp to a nearby prison, where then they were forced to serve out the rest of their prison sentence, right? A prison sentence given to them by Nazis, I just want to clarify. And so sometimes these pink triangle survivors were then put in prison and served up to 2 or 3 more years in prison before they were ever liberated. And so this is a moment where it's kind of the first example of a pretty systematic erasure of queer people from the broader understanding of who constituted a victim of the Nazi regime. Because clearly the Allies and then the Germans themselves were saying, like, okay, men with the pink triangle were not really victims, right? They were criminals, and so we're going to re-imprison them. After the war, a number of gay survivors decided to break their silence and tell their story by applying for official recognition and compensation first from the Allied powers, but then directly from East and West Germany themselves. And this is actually the moment where my kind of project shifted from looking at the Holocaust itself to looking at the post-war period, because I came across a document in which a gentleman named Bruno, who had been imprisoned and physically castrated by the Nazis for being gay, applies to be recognized and get compensation. And the compensation board denies his rejection and says, we're denying it because you're gay. Like, they just so explicitly stated that. And at first I thought, oh, wow, this must be a fluke. But the more I dug, the more I found that actually every single gay man, because at the time it was pretty much just gay men applying, all were rejected to a T. Every single one of them were rejected. And so what we see then is this post-war silencing of these voices, which then would have effects well into the post-war period. And the last thing I want to mention, and then I'll give the floor back to you, Noah, is that I mentioned that the Nazis, they inherited this law, paragraph 175, but in 1935 they amended it to give themselves this more power. In both East and West Germany, when they were founded as nations in 1949, both of those countries kept the specific Nazi version of that law. And East Germany, this is that, right? That's the communist side. They actually make the really surprising decision not to enforce it. Well, not to enforce it very vigorously. I won't give them a clean pass. But West Germany, the democratic nation, decides they uphold it in several court cases, but then they also use it. So now, Anne, if you can put that graph back up, if I showed you the graph earlier of the number of paragraph 175 convictions during the Nazi period, but if you expand that to show the full life of paragraph 175, you'll see quite a shocking trend in the line. And in fact, over the first 2 decades, of West Germany's existence, they used the Nazi version of the law to arrest 100,000 gay men in their new democratic republic, again, with the Nazi version of the law. And so this led a influential theologian and historian named Hans-Joachim Schultz to claim as late as 1963 that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hadn't ended yet.
I'm wondering if Anne got dropped from the call for some reason. So while we wait for her to rejoin, I'll keep us sort of moving along here, and then perhaps we can revisit the graph if we're looking at it in the question period at the end. Jake, obviously the title of your book is Pink Triangle Legacies. Could you just tell us a little bit more about the Pink Triangle and why it specifically is so important to this history?
Yeah, thanks. As I mentioned, kind of briefly through the whirlwind, run through the history we just did. In the concentration camp system, each of the prisoner groups were labeled with a colored triangle to denote the reason for their imprisonment. So here you can see that the graph. Thanks for showing that, Anne. Clearly, the line, the number of convictions goes down as the Nazis are defeated. But by 1949, when West Germany is established, the line goes straight back up. So really a stark visualization of the decision for this new country to continue using the Nazis' version of the law. So now back to Noah, to your question about the Pink Triangle. This was the badge that labeled gay prisoners in the concentration camp universe. But by the 1970s, we begin to see both in West Germany, but also in the United States, across Europe and North America, the emergence of a political gay liberation movement. And during this time, the process of coming out, of publicly claiming a gay identity, was seen and understood by these gay activists not just as a personal decision, right, to kind of personally come out of the closet, but also as a necessary political tactic, as a way to show kind of the size of the LGBTQ community, but also to establish themselves as a kind of a political minority that needed to be protected by and from the government. And so in West Germany, there was a group of activists who began suggesting that one way to come out was to wear a gay symbol. And of course, this struck all kind of conversations about what is a gay symbol and what would that look like? What are we going to pick? And in 1972, a book called The Men with the Pink Triangle was published. And this was the very first book written by a gay concentration camp survivor that told about their story. And so suddenly these gay activists in West Germany had the answer to their story. These gay activists looked back to their own history, and they found this really powerful symbol, and they picked the pink triangle as what they called the only logical symbol of gay liberation, because they knew that their fellow Germans would recognize it as a concentration camp symbol, and that it would be a marker to them that that essentially their Nazi past was not so far in history, right? That persecution continued. And so in doing so, they really transformed the symbol of the pink triangle from a badge of, right, criminality and damnation and shame into something that they said, we're going to rob this of its negative power, and being gay is no longer shameful. And in fact, we're going to wear this symbol with pride. So this all happened in West Germany in about 1972 into like 1973. But it didn't stay in Germany for very long. It was in the fall of 1974, a activist group in New York City called the Gay Activists Alliance. They were organizing a protest in favor of a gay rights bill that was being discussed in the city council at the time. And they decided to create a pink triangle badge, like well, not a badge, I guess it was like more of a button. And they wore it in their protests, and this became the first documented instance of the pink triangle being used in the United States in a gay rights context. But what I find really interesting, and we talk about, or I talk about in the book, is that when American gay activists adopted this symbol, they also essentially adopted a chapter of German history as their own. And they felt that they were able to do that because they were beginning to understand and conceptualize being gay or being LGBTQ as an identity that transcended national borders, right? And that they, by nature of being LGBT, they could share a history, whether it was in Germany or in America. It connected them across kind of these national boundaries. And so while this all began in the 1970s, by the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely recognizable and used symbol of gay rights throughout North America. Toronto played a really big role in the rediscovery and reclamation of the pink triangle, but also all across Europe as well. And so here you can see kind of just a selection of some of the posters and buttons that feature the pink triangle, both in German and in English. And this symbol came to resonate with LGBT people of all kind of sexual identities and gender identities, but also racial and ethnic backgrounds and class experiences as well.
Fantastic. Jake, you spoke earlier about sort of the immediate post-war period and then the taking up in West Germany of paragraph 175 again later on. You have a chapter in your book on the efforts to memorialize the Nazis' LGBTQ plus victims. Can you tell us a little bit about that and also sort of about the journey of compensation throughout the remainder of the 20th century and even to now? So.
Yeah, no, that could probably be its own book. I mean, it's such a interesting topic. But as you can imagine, the German government, the German public just completely ignored, silenced, and swept under the rug the experiences of LGBTQ folks in the Nazi period for so long that the efforts to, first of all, like the gay activists were first of all just focusing on getting society to even acknowledge that queer people were victimized, right? And so that began really in earnest in the 70s. By the late 80s, they were beginning to try to turn those efforts for acknowledgement into efforts for, concrete memorialization. And as you might imagine, they faced a lot of pushback. The very first application to have a memorial to the Pink Triangle prisoners was at Dachau concentration camp memorial site. That was in 1985, and it was rejected. In fact, it was rejected again and again and again for 10 years. It wasn't until 1995 that was allowed to be placed on the memorial grounds. Eventually, the gay activists were successful in winning the efforts to memorialize their community. In 2008, Germany dedicated a national memorial to the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. But it, of course, was not without debate and scandal, because it raised a lot of questions about, even in the LGBTQ community, who gets to be counted as victims. And a lot of scholars and activists, well, I will say a lot, primarily gay men, argued that, in fact, only gay men could be counted as victims of the Nazi regime because they were targeted specifically with paragraph 175. And so originally, the original design for that memorial was to memorialize only gay men. And to this day, we still have a long way to go to fully memorialize the lesbian victims, for example, the trans victims, these kind of other queer identities that aren't really included in many of the memorials to the Nazis gave victims. And in fact, I'm sure you're aware, Noah, that it was only in this year, I think it was in April of 2022, that the first memorial to the Nazis' lesbian victims was able to be permanently placed at the Ravensbrück concentration camp site, which is, right, this was the concentration camp for women. So this, in 2022, this is still a topic that we are fiercely debating. And it also just, I think, goes to show that we have a long way to go in crafting a truly inclusive memory of the Nazi era.
Yeah. Okay, I guess, well, we're at a time when we can accept questions from the audience. Jake, thank you so much for speaking to all of these things. I'm seeing some things go into the chat here. From Dan Klein, do we have any numbers that we can get to understand the magnitude of this suffering, or perhaps like how do we, come to understand sort of the qualitative aspects of this, quantitative?
That's a good question, Dan. Thanks. I would say that the nature of the Nazi record keeping system makes it kind of hard to come with definitive answers to that. The clearest answers we have come around cases of paragraph 175. And so again, but this is, again, that means we have numbers on men who had sex with men. And so that we know that about 100,000 were arrested, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 were sent to the concentration camps. Another statistic, if we want to get, I guess, qualitative about it, is that within the concentration camps, the men with the pink triangle, 2/3 of them died in the camps, which is an unusually high mortality rate for, within the group of prisoners that were not selected for genocide or mass murder. Right? The Nazis' official policy was that they were going to cure or re-educate these queer men and then reintegrate them back into society. But of course, we can question question that policy when ultimately 2/3 were killed while in the camps. We have less statistics on the fate of lesbians and transgender people because they weren't targeted with one single law. But there are a number of really great scholars right now, Anna Haikova and Laurie Moorhofer, Ashton Bodie, to just name a few, who are doing that statistical, deep dive work in the archives to begin kind of collating where, they can find like the number of trans people that were arrested under multiple different laws to be able to come up with kind of more of a total number. So unfortunately, those just don't exist at this time. But I'm excited that probably in the next 2 to 3 years is going to be a very productive time for people who are interested in this topic, because there's going to be a number of books coming out in the next 2 to 3 years that will really shed light on this topic.
So I'm seeing quite a few come through now, which is wonderful. From Anne, given the resistance to memorialize LGBTQ+ victims of the Shoah, have you received pushback or negative responses to your research since publishing this book from the academic community, the lay community? Yeah.
I would say I've had more, I experienced more pushback during the research phase of it. I will just, cross my fingers and be thankful that I've had only positive experiences since the book has come out in September. But during the research phase, I multiple times found myself talking to archivists saying, no, we don't have anything on that topic. When I can look online and see that it says that you do have research, you do have material on that topic. I found it very hard to get funding for this topic. And of course, I have no, direct proof that it was, rejected only because it was on LGBTQ topics. But I had, I even had people come up at conferences, one in particular that came up and told me I should just give up on this topic because no one's going to take me seriously, and that I'm not going to be able to access the material I need. So I should just focus my time on something that's more doable. And so, those were some kind of direct issues of or examples of pushback. But I will say that those were the exceptions, because in most cases, the network of mostly queer people who are researching, preserving, telling this history are so incredibly giving with their time, uplifting each other, that it's kind of like once you find one person, they'll connect you with like this entire network. And so even the archives that I ended up using were not the big state archives in Berlin or Bonn. They were small community, almost grassroots community centers run by LGBT volunteers who would meet me after their day job at 5 o'clock. And then we would sit in the archive, until 9 or 10 o'clock that night while I'm rummaging through the material. And they would say, you know what, just stay as long as you want. Like, I'll go get us supper if you want me to. And so that to me really outweighs the negative pushback that I got.
We kind of have two questions that are connected here, so I'm going to ask in two parts, I guess. But from Pamela Cameron and her viewing party, how were LGBTQ plus people identified to be detained and imprisoned? And as sort of a offshoot of that, Michael Savage points out that the Nazis apparently labeled people as Jews who may not have identified that way, i.e. paternal grandfather. Is there any evidence that people were labeled as homosexual who did not identify as such? And I know you spoke to like civilian reports and that being one of the primary ways that folks were persecuted. So yeah.
Well, those are great questions. So thanks. First of all, hello to the viewing party. That's pretty cool. That's to me, that's one of the most jarring parts of this history that I studied, because on the one hand, it's not super surprising to me that the Nazis were homophobic and transphobic, and that they would, put resources to try to destroy this community. But what I wasn't expecting, and maybe I was just naive, I wasn't expecting the level that ordinary Germans supported and contributed to the Nazis' campaign against the LGBTQ community. The examples that I got, as I said, over a third of the cases that went to the court were because of neighbors, co-workers, landlords turning people in. There's an example uncovered by the historian Laurie Marhofer, who of a gender nonconforming person who their neighbor turned her in. The neighbor in the apartment building turned her into the Gestapo because this woman, her name was I'm forgetting her last name, but her name was Elsa, I believe. Elsa Totska, liked to wear like suits and kept a really short cropped haircut. And so this neighbor said, well, she dresses like a man. She's a man hater. I've never seen her bring a man home. Don't you find that suspicious? And so the Gestapo then has her on the radar. We don't know if she never identified whether she was straight or lesbian or what. But the fact that a neighbor considered her gender identity as being outside the norms was enough for that neighbor then to go turn her into the Gestapo. Unfortunately, the Nazis also used entrapment. So they would dress in plain clothes and go to gay bars or parks and essentially catch gay men in the act. They also, when they would arrest someone, they would torture them and force them to give the names of fellow, gay or lesbian friends, which is really, really unfortunate. So there were a number of ways, right, that the Nazis identified and arrested queer people, but I will just again emphasize that they would not have been able to do so without the passive or active contributions from the German society. And to the second question about, identity and were all these people actually gay or not? And that's a question that probably will never have a answer to. I would say that probably not all of these people were actually, homosexual or actually transgender. Just as today there's a number of different sexual identities and practices and lifestyles that that the Nazis would have lumped together under the term homosexual. But for them, everything hinged on same-sex activity. And we also know, and this will be my last point on this, is after the 1935 amendment of the law, you almost needed no evidence whatsoever to get a conviction. And so I find myself wondering how many of those civilian denunciations, for example, were legitimate in the terms that they were actually turning in a gay person, or could it have been one neighbor really didn't like another person, or another person had a business that put too much competition on their own, and so then they knew if they went to the Nazis, they wouldn't necessarily be forced to come up with a lot of evidence about why, if this person was gay or not. So a lot of times, even just the rumor of paragraph 175 was enough to at least be arrested.
Yeah. Another question here. Is it difficult to find personal testimonies from survivors? And maybe you can speak to, I guess, how what we talked about paragraph 175 remaining in the legislation for East and West Germany. How would that have influenced the ability of some survivors to testify? Yeah.
No, that's a really great question that honestly gets at the heart of my book, because it is extremely rare to find, especially written testimony from gay survivors, or I should say any LGBTQ survivor, because I'm not going to say all, but a lot of these survivors knew that leaving a diary, leaving love letters, a postcard could end up being used as evidence against them in court, even after the Nazis were defeated. And so unfortunately, they felt the need to destroy a lot of this physical evidence. Again, not all. There are some archives in Germany now that have very rare, beautiful collections of queer people who did leave a physical mark, right? But there were a number of grassroots scholars who, beginning in the 80s and into the 90s, began trying to identify LGBTQ survivors to capture their testimony and save it for history. And a lot of the survivors did so under the safety of anonymity. They use a pseudonym. But again, whereas for other victim groups, we might have entire databases full of recorded testimony. There are probably written testimony from maybe 20 LGBTQ survivors that exists in German, maybe in English, and the number might be a little larger. But the point being that it's a very small number, and that is not a coincidence. As you mentioned, Noah, this is a direct result of particularly West Germany enforcing Nazi-era policies and homophobic policies that essentially made not only expressing one's sexuality, but one's memories illegal, right? Because if you talked about what happened, you would be admitting to acts that were still illegal. And I have to say that I don't want to put all the blame on just the lawyers and the judges. I from my own research, feel quite confident in saying that the professional historians were just as culpable in this, because the only time that historians in the 60s, 70s, 80s and I'm talking about mainstream historians, mentioned LGBT people in the Nazi period was to say that the top-ranking Nazis were all gay, or as they would say, homosexual perverts, right? So there was always this idea to try to only talk about gay people when they were perpetrators, but never when they were victims. And to me, in not uncovering this history and continuously silencing it, that allowed the justification of West Germany to continue its persecution. So to me, I believe that the historical silencing from academics is directly linked to the continued persecution through the legislative branch.
We have another question here from Joey Wolf about if there are any researchers soliciting information within Jewish communities today, especially children of survivors, looking for stories of elders who appear not to have been straight or were living like gender and sexual diverse lives. Yeah.
You know, I personally am not aware of such efforts. I think that it would be a admirable task. And I know, Noah, maybe you could speak to this. I know you worked on, a project with oral history testimony. The Shoah Foundation in California did manage to get a few oral histories of gay survivors captured before most of them passed away. But yeah, I personally am just not I don't know of efforts to kind of go through like maybe the second or third generation to get their thoughts on their elders.
Mm-hmm. And I don't specifically know about that either, but I do think that I mentioned before when we're approaching these histories where sometimes our language is insufficient and we don't wish to like impose sort of modern conceptions onto the past because it might simplify or limit our understanding of these very nuanced experiences. There's I guess a lot of effort to like re-examine these stories, Joey, like you say, of elders who appeared not to have been straight, or of even just archival materials, police reports, legal documents that like, I guess, reading them against the grain to try and maybe expand our definition past identity categories and towards like a larger, I guess, looking for patterns of like cross-dressing, or, and I don't mean that just to then go, oh, well, that person is this way, but to understand that there's more nuances maybe to people's experiences, and to speak to the limitations, Jake, that you described with legislation afterwards, and the way that that influences our ability to see queerness in the past. So,
yeah, thank you for that. That was really, really nicely said, Noah.
So if anybody has any final questions or remarks, please feel free to add them to the chat now, or else I think we'll move maybe to a close. Jennifer Evans says, congratulations on the book, Jake.
Hey, Jen.
So speaking to congratulations on the book, Jake, we have resources that we'll paste into the chat, further resources about how to access Jake's book. You can purchase a personalized autographed copy of Pink Triangle Legacies. You can use the promotion code that will be provided in the chat as well. We also, Jake has provided us with some wonderful English language additional resources about this topic and about his work. So yeah, thank you so much, Jake, for joining us.
Thanks, Noah, and thanks to everyone for joining. And I also just want to say thanks again to the Jewish Federation of Ottawa. We, especially here in the United States, are currently, enthralled in a national debate about, what types of information can be discussed and learned about in school. And a lot of times LGBTQ topics are being, considered to be banned. And so I really appreciate this, the Federation for providing this space for all of us to come together and talk about this history freely and openly with each other. So, and again, also just want to thank Noah for moderating this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. That was just excellent. On behalf of the Shoah Committee and the Jewish Federation of Ottawa, Dr. Newsome and Noah, thank you for your very powerful conversation. I think it was very generative, and we are all walking away with something to think about. I think also just Dr. Newsome, thank you for your research, for bringing to life these previously untold stories of lived LGBTQ plus experiences of the Shoah. Your rigorous research in this book, it really holds the capacity to broaden our understanding and to transform the collective memory of the Shoah. And so we're so grateful for your time and your commitment, and just for joining us here tonight. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who was able to come and participate. A big shout out to the Shoah Committee of the Jewish Federation of Ottawa, who is made up of our tireless volunteers who help to ensure that we continue to have generative and engaging programs around Holocaust education locally. And a big shout out to Carly McPherson and the Greenberg Families Library for always ensuring that we have a well-stocked library, including books like the Pink Triangle Legacies, which is available at the Greenberg Families Library, that they're always available to our community. So thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and we wish you a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Good job. Very interesting. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you both. That was really terrific. Thank you, Carly.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks, Sarah.
say
Thank you,
good night
Noah. It was
now.
great.
Have a good evening. Take care.
Good night.